The old man spoke with a low, steady voice, his words carrying a weight that seemed too heavy for the quiet air around them. "The old cows who could sleep in the saddle," he said. "They call the others just passengers on a horse. But those old men who can ride, they know what it takes to defeat Hitler." It was the summer of 1942, and the Russian city after Russian city fell to the invaders. Moscow, too, was gripped by the threat. Yet in the streets, new posters began to appear. They greeted and welcomed their allies, allies whose aid had already started to arrive in Russian ports. It was a time of uncertainty, a time where survival depended on more than just strength. It relied on endurance, on pushing past the limits of what the human body and mind could handle. In the late 1940s, Russian researchers conducted a chilling experiment. They kept 5 political prisoners awake for 15 days, using a gas-based stimulant that was as toxic as it was effective. The prisoners, already deemed enemies of the state during the war, were confined to a sealed chamber where their oxygen intake was carefully monitored to prevent the gas from killing them. There were no closed-circuit cameras, only microphones and thick glass portholes through which the researchers could observe them. The chamber was sparse. Cots without bedding, running water, a toilet, and enough dried food to last the prisoners a month. The prisoners were promised freedom if they could endure the test, if they could resist sleep for 30 days. In the beginning, everything seemed fine. They hardly complained, though the conversations they had started to take on a darker tone after the 4th day. By the 5th day, the prisoners began to exhibit signs of severe paranoia. They stopped speaking to one another and began whispering, to the microphones, then to the one-way mirrors. Strangely, they all seemed to think that by betraying each other, by turning over their comrades, they could earn the favor of the researchers. At first, the researchers believed this was a side effect of the gas, but the behavior only worsened. On the 9th day, the first of them began to scream. His voice, once full of desperation, turned hoarse after hours of screaming. He ran the length of the chamber, yelling at the top of his lungs for 3 hours straight. The researchers speculated that he had torn his vocal cords, though it was what came next that truly unsettled them. The others did not react. They simply continued their strange whispering, indifferent to the madness unfolding around them. But when the second prisoner began to scream, the others took a chilling action. They tore the books apart, smeared pages with their own excrement, and calmly pressed them against the glass portholes. The screaming stopped, and with it, the whispering. The researchers by this point had become increasingly concerned. No sound came from the chamber for days, not even the usual faint whispers. The oxygen consumption of the chamber, however, suggested that all 5 were still alive. It was as if they were exerting themselves at an intense level, though no activity could be heard. By the 14th day, the researchers, desperate for any sign of life or response, decided to do something they had promised they would never do. They used the intercom. They hoped for a reaction, any reaction from the captives. "We are opening the chamber to test the microphones," they said. "Step away from the door and lie flat on the floor, or you will be shut in. Compliance will earn one. Of you, your immediate freedom." The response came as a single, calm voice. "We no longer wish to be free. We no longer wish to be freed." The words hung in the air, chilling the blood of the researchers who had been monitoring the experiment. Debate erupted among them and the military officials funding the project. The test subjects, it seemed, had descended into a state so far removed from human that it defied all reason. With no further response through the intercom, it was decided, against the warnings of some, to open the chamber at midnight on the 15th day. The chamber was flushed of the stimulant gas and filled with fresh air, and almost immediately the microphones began to pick up voices. 3 distinct voices pleaded for the gas to be turned back on, as though begging for the life of someone they loved. The soldiers entered the chamber, and the screams of the prisoners grew louder, a discordant symphony of madness. What they saw inside was beyond comprehension. 4 of the 5 test subjects were still alive, though none could truly be called alive in any conventional sense. The food rations had not been touched since day 5. A horrific scene greeted the soldiers as they entered. The drain in the center of the chamber was clogged with chunks of flesh from the dead subjects, stuffed inside and blocking the way, allowing water to accumulate on the floor. How much of it was blood was impossible to determine, but it was clear that something far darker than mere survival had occurred. The remaining test subjects were barely human. Their bodies had been torn apart, skin and muscle ripped away in places, exposing bone and sinew. The wounds on their fingertips were not from biting, as the researchers had initially suspected, but from their own hands, self-inflicted, deliberate. The body parts that had been removed, the stomachs, intestines, and organs below the rib cage, were gone, laid out around them in twisted, grotesque patterns. The lungs, heart, and diaphragm remained, but the rest of the organs had been meticulously removed. The most horrifying detail, however, was that despite the gruesome state of their bodies, their digestive tracts were still working. They were eating, but not food. They were consuming themselves, ripping flesh from their own bodies and devouring it. Most of the soldiers, many of them elite Russian operatives, refused to go back into the chamber. They stood frozen, watching the grotesque scene unfold. The subjects, still living and apparently aware, screamed louder, demanding that the gas be turned back on, begging to never fall asleep. When the soldiers tried to remove the subjects from the chamber, the fight they put up was violent and desperate. One soldier had his throat ripped out during the struggle. Another was gravely injured when one of the prisoners tore his testicles from his body, an act of primal fury that spoke to the depths of the madness that had taken root in their minds. As the remaining soldiers dragged the test subjects out of the chamber, one could not help but wonder if the true horror had only just begun. An artery in one of the soldiers' legs had been severed by one of the test subjects' teeth, a gruesome injury that led to the death of 5 more soldiers. The horrors did not end there. Several of the soldiers, unable to live with the trauma they had witnessed, took their own lives in the weeks that followed. But the true terror, it seemed, was far from over. In the chaos of the struggle to contain the remaining test subjects, one of the living prisoners suffered a ruptured spleen and bled out almost instantly. The medical team moved quickly, attempting to sedate him, but no amount of drugs could subdue the man. Despite being injected with over 10 times the normal human dose of a morphine derivative, the subject fought like an animal cornered in a trap. In the process, he broke the ribs and arms of one of the doctors. For 2 full minutes, his heart continued to beat, even as the blood had drained from his body, leaving more air in his vascular system than blood. Even after his heart finally stopped, he continued to struggle. For 3 minutes, he flailed and screamed, attacking anyone within reach and repeating the word "more" over and over, weaker and weaker, until finally he fell silent. The remaining 3 test subjects were heavily restrained and moved to a medical facility. The 2, whose vocal cords were still intact, begged continuously for the gas, demanding to be kept awake. The most severely injured of the 3 was taken to the only surgical operating room the facility had. As they prepared him for surgery, intending to place his organs back into his body, they discovered something horrifying. He was immune to the sedative they had been giving him. When the anesthetic gas was administered to put him under, he fought violently against his restraints. Despite the weight of a 200 lb soldier holding down his wrist, he managed to tear through a thick leather strap. It took far more anesthetic than usual to finally subdue him. The instant his eyelids closed, his heart stopped. During the autopsy of this subject, the findings were both fascinating and chilling. His blood had triple the normal level of oxygen, an abnormality that could not be explained. His muscles, still attached to his skeletal frame, were badly torn. He had broken 9 bones in his desperate struggle to resist sedation, most of them from the force his own muscles had exerted on them. The second survivor was the first to begin screaming. His vocal cords had been destroyed, rendering him unable to beg or protest. When the anesthetic gas was brought near him, he shook his head violently in refusal. However, when the suggestion was made to perform the surgery without any anesthetic, he nodded in agreement. For 6 hours, the surgeon worked on him, replacing his abdominal organs and attempting to cover them with what remained of his skin. The surgeon later reported that the subject did not react at all during the procedure, remaining eerily still as the surgeons worked. The horror of what they had witnessed, of what they had unleashed, was beyond anything they had ever imagined. "It should be medically impossible for the patient to still be alive," one terrified nurse whispered, trembling as she assisted in the surgery. She had seen something that had no place in the realm of medical science. Each time the patient's eyes met hers, his mouth curled into a smile. When the surgery concluded, the subject looked directly at the surgeon and began to wheeze loudly, struggling to speak. Assuming it was of utmost importance, the surgeon had pen and paper brought to the patient so he could write a message. The message was simple: keep cutting. The other 2 test subjects were given the same surgery, again without anesthetic. They had to be injected with a paralytic for the duration of the procedure. However, the surgeon found it impossible to operate while the subjects laughed continuously, their eyes wild with madness. When the paralytic wore off, they began straining against their restraints, trying to escape, and when they could speak, they immediately asked for the stimulant gas again, in response to the researchers' questions about why they had mutilated themselves, ripped out their own organs, and why they wanted the gas. The only reply they gave was a chilling, "I must remain awake." All 3 subjects were restrained again and returned to the chamber, awaiting a final decision. The researchers were under immense pressure from their military superiors, furious over the failure of the experiment's stated goals. While some researchers recommended euthanizing the survivors, the commanding officer, an ex-KGB officer, saw potential and wanted to see what would happen if the subjects were exposed to the gas again. The researchers objected strongly but were overruled. As the subjects were prepared to be sealed in the chamber once more, they were connected to EEG monitors, and their restraints were padded. The chamber was sealed, and, to everyone's surprise, the subjects stopped struggling the moment it was revealed they would be put back on the gas. It became clear that all 3 were putting up an immense effort to stay awake. One subject that could still speak began humming loudly and continuously. The mute subject strained his legs against the restraints. The remaining subject, the first to be wired to the EEG, was blinking rapidly, his eyes darting between panic and exhaustion. Most of the researchers focused on his brain waves, which appeared normal for most of the time. However, there were moments when his brain waves inexplicably flatlined. It was as though he was repeatedly suffering brain death before his brain returned to normal. As the paper from the monitor scrolled, one nurse's eyelids grew heavy, and just as her head slipped against the pillow, his brainwaves flatlined for the final time, simultaneously with the stop of his heart. The last surviving subject who could speak began to scream, begging to be sealed inside the chamber. The researcher's brainwaves flatlined, showing the same pattern as someone who had just died from sleep. The commander gave the order to seal the chamber with both surviving subjects still inside, alongside 3 researchers. One of these researchers, desperate and fearful of what had transpired, drew his gun and shot the commander point blank between the eyes. He then turned the gun on the mute subject and blew his brains out. With no other option, he pointed the gun at the remaining subject, still restrained to the bed, and screamed, "I won't be locked in here with these things, not with you." "What, are you?" he demanded, shaking with terror. The subject smiled. "Have you forgotten so easily?" the subject asked, his voice soft, almost seductively. "We are you. We are the madness that lurks within you all, begging to be free at every moment. In your deepest animal mind, we are what you hide from in your beds every night. We are what you sedate into silence and paralysis when you go to the nocturnal haven where we cannot tread." The researcher froze, his fingers still on the trigger. Slowly, he aimed at the subject's heart and fired. The EEG flatlined. The subject, weak and struggling, choked out one final phrase, a whisper that would haunt the researcher's mind forever. So nearly free.